So welcome to the Baroque. We're going to be looking today at how the Renaissance essentially transforms into a style that was at first pejoratively called the Baroque, and then eventually that name really comes to symbolize kind of glorious and voluptuous sculptural architecture, painting, and design of the 17th century. So the Baroque is very much a continuation of what takes place in the Renaissance, building on that classical vocabulary that's developed and expanded during the course of the Renaissance, and then taking that and building even further on it, bringing in a kind of stretching and pulling and sculptural element to it that really ends up reflecting a great deal of what's happening in Europe during the 17th century. The Baroque is always a style about wealth and power. But the way that those ideas of wealth and power are translated in each of the countries that we're going to be looking at actually ends up shaping the way that the Baroque looks. Like the Renaissance, it begins in Italy. Italy remains a center of design because it also remains a center of power through the Catholic Church. Much of the wealth that we saw in the Renaissance that came from banking and trade, although still there, is not as concentrated in Italy as it had been in the 15th century. It's kind of spread out across Europe. And colonial money that's coming in from the Americas and Africa and trade with China and the East is actually kind of also making Italian wealth in terms of those trading cities and the banking cities a little less important, but it continues to really fill the coffers in Rome. And so we see the church remaining a really major patron of the arts in the Baroque. Just to kind of get a sense of how we kind of move from the Renaissance into the Baroque, we're going to look at a few comparisons here. And what I'm comparing here is Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper, painted roughly at the end of the 15th century. And I'm comparing it here to the Feast of the House of Levi from 1573 by Veronese. So what we're seeing is really high Renaissance painting compared with a Baroque painting, sort of at the beginning of the Baroque. It's not like right in the middle of it there, but it's expressing a lot of the ideas. In Leonardo's painting, what we see is a perspective, and we talked about that, about how Renaissance painting very often has this kind of focal point, and we see the use of perspective as well in the design of architecture. This is a one-point perspective that really draws the viewer into the image. Now, Veronese is also using perspective, but he's not just drawing you into the image, he's also projecting out from the image so that the architectural elements and even the people seem to be kind of layered and coming into the foreground and maybe even beyond the edges of the painting. We also see how the figures themselves are far more active. They're not just sitting staid at the table, kind of interacting with each other in a very kind of simple, triangulated form. Here we have a great deal of interaction between the figures. They're more sculptural, there's more movement, and the actual behavior of these individuals, the way they're dressed, the characters that they represent has become quite varied. In fact, in some ways, somewhat sacrilegious. They were not the kinds of people that one would expect to find in a painting of something so important as the Last Supper. And so the church suggests that he takes these figures out. Now, Veronese is really pushing the envelope with this, not just in terms of style, not just in terms of his art, but also in terms of a kind of a social situation. And what he says is, okay, fine, I'll take the figures out, but in fact he does not. And he goes back and he just changes the name of the painting. And in changing it to the Feast of the House of Levi, he then is depicting a supper with Christ where sinners were present, and so it makes it more acceptable. Here we're comparing Brunelleschi's Pazzi Chapel from 1460 that we took a look at in the Renaissance lecture with San Carlo alla Quattro Fontane, which is San Carlo at the Four Fountains by Francesco Borromini, a very important Baroque architect in Rome from 1641. These are both central planned chapels. In other words, they're really just one room with the focus on that central space. They're both completely symmetrical on the interior. The difference in the plan is that Borromini's chapel is a little bit more oval and Brunelleschi's is square in terms of plan. But they both have a dome at the top. They're both using classical vocabulary. You can see columns with capitals, coffering, all kinds of things going on that are similar in both of these spaces, yet they're really, really different. And part of that has to do with the kind of approach to how the classicism is being used. Brunelleschi's chapel has a kind of quiet, mathematically calculated use of classicism, creating a space that sort of induces contemplative thinking. While what Borromini is expressing is much more active, much more ecstatic. He's actually expressing the kind of glory of religion through his space. He draws the viewer into the space. The shaped space kind of brings the viewer to the center, and then their attention rises to the dome that's lit in such a way that it seems as if it's floating away. And all of this is done purely with the placement of the windows. The exteriors of the chapels express the same kind of difference, where Brunelleschi's has this very kind of geometric quality to it. It's got a kind of lightness because of the attenuated columns, but it also has a kind of crispness. It's very much a geometric form in the landscape, whereas Borromini's interacts with the landscape. It's actually undulating and fitting into the space and bringing in one of the four fountains, because there are, in fact, four fountains at this corner, into the corner of the building. We can see some of these differences in domestic architecture as well, not quite as extreme as we see in church architecture in Rome, in part because a lot of what's being focused on in the rebuilding of Rome and the renovation of buildings is the kind of glory of the Catholic Church. Many of the villas are being built by families whose wealth comes from their connection to the church, the families of popes, etc. But there isn't quite the same sense of movement in these buildings. So while we can compare here the Sala della Prospettiva with this perspective frescoes on the walls from 1510 to the Palazzo Colonnolo Gallery Great Hall, from the mid-1600s, and see some differences. It's not quite as great a difference as we saw with the chapels. Certainly, the Great Hall is grander, and in fact, that is one thing that changes. Buildings get bigger, there's more wealth, there's more money being spent on this kind of building, and the interiors become more glorious. So we see lots of really extraordinary ceilings, where the Renaissance was focusing on ceilings quite often in a space. In the Baroque, we see just really amazing ceilings. And what they do in these interiors is really integrate that painting, which is very illusionistic, which brings in architectural elements with human beings as well. So we've got angels and architecture flying around in the ceiling. It also has really heavy cornices, lots of gilding, and real architectural elements as well as those that are illusionistic. So for instance, at the end of this hall, we have real columns that create this kind of internal portico, where in the Villa Farnesia, what we've got is a fresco of columns, and we see a lot more real architectural elements being included in interiors in the Baroque. So let's take a closer look at the Baroque in Italy and think a little bit about where the church's desire is coming from to create these really extraordinary buildings. Probably the greatest accomplishment architecturally in the 17th century in Rome was the completion of St. Peter's, a building that had been in the process of being built and going through changes already for more than a century. And some of the really great architects had already worked on this building, including Bramante, who's essentially responsible for much of the plan, and Michelangelo, who's responsible for much of the plan of the dome. But by the turn of the 16th century, what we see is a Catholic Church that's besieged by the Reformation, that's really fighting against the Reformation, and by that turn of the century feels that they've kind of won some ground. So they're in a kind of celebratory mood. Now, this problem between Catholics and the Reformers or the Protestant Church is one that doesn't just go away. It continues to play a role in politics all throughout the 17th century and even into the 18th century. But at this point in time, Rome feels secure enough to start spending some money and focusing on rebuilding and creating more glorious churches. Now, part of that comes from the idea that if you've got really fantastic architecture, then people who come to worship are awed and excited. And the Baroque was the perfect style for this and really develops in part because of it. So when we look at St. Peter's, what we see is kind of the culmination of this. It's an extraordinary building just in scale alone. This building is massive. The dome, as I said, had been designed by Michelangelo, but it's completed after his death. The facade of the building is designed by Carlo Maderno, who's actually responsible for a lot of the building of the interior and exterior in terms of what we see today. And by the middle of the century, Gian Lorenzo Bernini is building this piazza in front of St. Peter's and also working on the interior. Now, the piazza is quite extraordinary. He's really defining the space in which many important public events will take place. And he's doing this with this massive colonnade that continues the sense of awe that the scale of St. Peter's already brings to people because it's just so tremendously large. And if you see here in this image, you can see the tiny little people running around at the base of these columns. They really are overwhelming. But it also creates a space with classical architecture that allows great events to take place and kind of flow into the building itself. And you can see here just what kind of events were taking place in front of St. Peter's in the 17th and 18th centuries. And so there was a lot of pomp and circumstance that went along with what was taking place at St. Peter's. In many ways today, it's not very representative because we've got massive crowds of people that are in there. Back then, you had these kind of very organized events that were taking place that included lots of spectators, but the whole thing was much more organized, very much in the way that the royal family would arrive at a palace. The Pope and the dignitaries that would arrive at St. Peter's would be given the same kind of pomp and circumstance. And this massive piazza really created a fantastic stage for that. Because of this, Bernini becomes probably one of the, if not the most famous architect in the 17th century. And it's really kind of the beginning of the time of really famous people in the arts. Prior to that, you didn't have too many of them, but Bernini becomes internationally known. As we enter St. Peter's, we come through Maderno's nave, and we can see that he's using classical vocabulary. We've got these colossal order pilasters with fluting and really ornate Corinthian capitals at the top. And then we have classically inspired ornament in the form of lozenges, but in this case, they have putti in them that are running up the sides of these arches. And what we're seeing here is a real integration of architecture, sculpture, and painting, and that's one of the other things that really marks the Baroque. It's a moment where an architect or an artist who's asked to put together a program for an interior, whether it be St. Peter's or some other grand space, is really thinking about all of the arts coming together and working together in order to express kind of singular idea. And so kind of the glory of God is expressed through all of the arts, and the movement through the space, the viewer and the way that they're drawn is expressed this way as well. So you're drawn to the crossing of the nave and the transept, in part because of the dome and the streaking light that comes into the space. And then at the center of that, we have Bernini's Baldacchino. Taking a closer look at this, it's actually a sculptural interpretation of a canopy, and it marks probably the most important place, not only in St. Peter's, but in all of Christendom, because this is where the Pope actually performs the service. And so this is a really, really important and holy place. It also happens to be a wonderfully Baroque piece of interior architecture with these twisting columns that not only have all of the movement of Baroque architecture, but also include all of these decorative elements that are applied and carved to the exterior of them with a little putti and all of that kind of delicate, ornate work, which just elevates this to another level of kind of aesthetic expression of religious belief. Just beyond the Baldacchino, you can see in the back there this kind of sunburst that's at the back of the nave, and that's the Cathedra Piety. And here you can see it up a little more closely. This is also by Bernini. And this kind of treatment of the back of the nave becomes something that we see in a lot of Baroque churches, not just here at St. Peter's, but in many others as well. And part of the draw of this is that it really expresses the kind of glory of the Holy Spirit. So we've got what looks like a sunburst from a distance. When you get a little bit closer, you can see the dove representing the Holy Spirit. And then this kind of explosion of light and angels, and the opportunity to express religion in such an exuberant way is really taken to the fullest here. And you can see that there's a complete integration of the architecture, and you can see that with the pilasters on either side, and the architectural elements below, and sculpture, and then the stained glass in the center of it, all of it expressing this one central idea. In Bernini's Saint Andrea a Quiriniella, we see the exterior of the building reaching now in much the same way that the arms of his piazza in front of St. Peter's does, but of course this is a much smaller building. And here what we're looking at is again one of these single room, centrally focused chapels. But it still has these kind of arms that reach around. And you can see how the facade of the building has an undulating quality. He's also got two different kind of orders there on the facade. He's got the fully expressed columns, and then in back of that, these kind of colossal order pilasters. The use of the demi-lune portico, the fact that above that is not just a pediment, but a broken pediment, all of this kind of creating a rhythm to the facade of the church that we then see on the interior as well. Again, a broken pediment, again, a sculptural element integrated into it. And you look at that, how that sculpture has tremendous movement. It draws your eye up into the dome of this chapel, sitting above paired columns that then create a frame into which one then looks. The painting behind expresses a religious idea, but also a movement and a kind of glorious movement. And then up above that is this light that's coming in through a kind of lantern up above, or a cupola that's allowing light to pour in. And again, expressing the idea of kind of the light of God, the light of religion, the Holy Spirit, whatever have you. It's, again, this idea of integrating the architecture with the idea and expressing it fully through the use of the architecture, through the use of sculpture, and through the use of painting. And you can really see how the angels are completely three-dimensionally integrated into all of that architecture. They're actually actually sitting on the capitals. They're actually flying up into that oculus at the top. This brings us back to Borromini's San Carlo that we looked at a little bit earlier. And one of the things that's really exciting about this building is the way that it squeezes into this small urban space, and yet manages to really create a tremendous presence there. And so although it's a relatively small building, it still feels quite extraordinary. Looking at the facade, one of the things that Borromini does is he layers the facade so that we see all kinds of architectural elements almost sitting behind those colossal order columns. Each of them has their own kind of rhythm. So we've got the columns on the very surface, and then the windows and niches seem as if they kind of run behind it. And this creates kind of excitement to the facade. Of course, the curves are also quite wonderful, and they help to kind of take what is a relatively flat facade in a very small and confined space and give it a sense of movement. This desire to create movement is sometimes talked about as plasticity or plastic. It's very plastic. Not plastic in the way that we think of plastic today, but plastic in its original meaning, malleable, able to be shaped and formed. And this is something that's really central to the way that Baroque architecture is expressed in the hands of the best of the Italian architects in the 17th century. Taking a look at the plan, you'll see that San Carlo is a centrally oriented chapel, but it's not circular, it's oval. And as one enters, their view is drawn to the apse. But there are also other interiors within this complex, including a courtyard that's just to the right of the chapel itself. What's striking about this interior is that the form of the interior really forces the viewer to follow Borromini's lead. And this happens in some of the best of the Baroque interiors. The kind of undulating form of the walls, the way that the light pours into the space, and the way that the decorative program is played out, all kind of orchestrates an experience that really includes the process of walking through the space. So of course, looking at it in still photography is not as good as being there, but I think you can get that from some of these images. Looking up, you can see how he's using classical elements, but in a very kind of loose way. This is not a Roman temple, not by any stretch of the imagination. Something else is happening here, something much more emotional. And this emotional expression comes in part through the use of light. And here you can see this window partially obscured by the architectural details that surround it, allowing light to be diffused into the space in a kind of mysterious way. And then you can see how sculptural elements are included in pretty much any part of the architecture that would very often, say, in a Renaissance interior, be flat. So there's lots of movement, lots of plasticity, and lots of integration of sculpture. Looking up at the dome, we find again that that idea of kind of spiritual light coming in through the center of the dome where an oculus would normally be. But we've also got light that diffuses from the sides, kind of really lighting that whole interior. And again, this use of apses and coffering in a really kind of sculptural way. What's interesting is that in this little tiny courtyard that's just to the right of the chapel itself, Borromini continues to use this really strong kind of hand of shaping this little space. And you can see how almost playful he becomes looking at the balustrade, and they've got a little detail there of the balustrade, and how he's alternated the position of the balustrades in order to create a rhythm even there. Just looking at this arch in the lower portion of the arcade, you can see right away a relationship to the work of Palladio. And certainly classical architecture in this kind of Palladian form, or what we've come to know as the Palladian form, is something that remains. We saw it as well in Brunelleschi's facade. It continues, this idea of the arch with the rectilinear openings on either side. But in the hands of a Baroque architect, it's no longer a flat plane. Now it's something that actually curves and surrounds this small court. So you can see how a lot of the vocabulary remains the same, but the way that it's being used is really quite different.